He was in and out in under 20 minutes. Barely touched the slice of apple pie I'd made that morning, the one with the sugar crust he used to love as a boy. He sat at the edge of the kitchen chair like he had somewhere better to be, which he probably did. His phone buzzed twice. He checked it both times. I tried to talk to him about the wild turkey I'd seen in the field that week, how the lilacs were finally blooming again near the fence, but his mind was elsewhere. When he stood up to leave, he gave me a quick hug that felt more like an obligation than a goodbye. "See you soon, Mom," he said. But he didn't. My name is Dorothy Langston. I'm 72 years old, and until a few months ago, I believed I was a mother who mattered. I believed in the kind of love that stays rooted, the kind that weathers distance and time. I raised my son on this land, in this old house with its leaning porch and creaking floors. I gave him everything I had, and I am here to tell you what happens when the person you love most begins to count you out. Not because you've wronged them, not because you've changed, but because they think you've outlived your usefulness. What I'm about to admit is something I never thought I'd do. But then again, I never thought I'd be waiting for a son who had already moved on without me. At first, I told myself he was just busy. That's what children do, don't they? They grow, they marry, they work too much. They get caught in the current of their own lives. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who nags or clings, so I waited. I baked. I kept the porch light on later than usual. I'd walk past the front window around dusk, glance at the gravel driveway, and imagine his car pulling in. I even set out 2 coffee cups some mornings, just in case he dropped by unannounced like he used to. But the weeks stretched thin. My messages went unanswered. When I called, he'd respond with a text hours later, always polite, always vague. "Things are hectic. We'll swing by soon." Soon became never. The house felt different in his absence, quieter, colder. Not in the air, but in the way the light fell differently through the windows, the way the walls seemed to hold their breath. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. A crack near the baseboard in the hallway, the way the hinges on the back door had begun to sag. I kept busy with chores, small repairs, the garden. But under all that movement was a stillness I didn't want to name. When your child stops showing up, there's a particular kind of silence that fills the space where their voice used to be. It doesn't shout, it doesn't sob, it just settles, like dust, over every surface, soft and suffocating. And in that silence, I began to wonder not just where my son had gone, but what else I had failed to see. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and warm over the fields, and the house is wrapped in a hush so complete you can hear the cicadas humming through the walls. I had just finished watering the potted plants on the windowsill and was wiping my hands on a dish towel when the phone rang in the other room. It wasn't mine. It was Andrew's spare cell, the one he kept here from years ago when he used to stay overnight, sometimes on weekends. I'd found it in the drawer a few days earlier, charging it out of habit more than anything. I didn't even realize it still worked. It rang twice and then answered itself, automatically syncing to the Bluetooth speaker I use for the radio in the kitchen. A voice, sharp and laughing, filled the room before I had time to react. It wasn't Andrew, not at first. It was someone else, a man, maybe one of his business friends. "Seriously, how long until the place is yours?" the voice asked, amused. "That land's worth a fortune now." Andrew's voice followed, casual and too confident. "Soon, I guess. She's not in great shape. And once it passes to me, we can clear it. Prime spot for condos, and the town's already soft on zoning." There was a pause. I stood there motionless, the towel still in my hands, heart knocking in my chest like something loose in a storm. Then the next part came, the sentence that changed everything. "She's too broke to matter now anyway." I didn't breathe. I couldn't. I just stared at the speaker like it had struck me. I waited for the laughter to fade, for them to hang up. But the conversation rolled on into talk of investors and timelines and permits. None of it mattered. I'd already heard what I needed to hear. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the words over and over, too broke to matter. As if all the years of raising him, feeding him, sitting up with him through chicken pox and heartbreak and finals had been erased by a balance sheet. I remembered the time I dipped into my retirement to help him when the market turned. I remembered co-signing a loan I couldn't afford. I remembered the birthday cards with $20 bills I still mailed to his children. And now I knew. I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a future asset, a line item waiting to be transferred. By morning, something inside me had shifted. Not broken exactly, just, realigned. There's a moment when grief gives way to something colder, something clearer. It isn't rage, it isn't even sadness. It's a kind of quiet decision-making, the slow turning of a key. I got out of bed, walked to the cedar chest in the hallway, and opened the drawer where I kept the land papers. They were still there. My name, still printed at the top. My signature still binding. Andrew had forgotten one thing in all his planning. I still held the deed. I hadn't opened that drawer in years. The cedar had dulled with time, its corners worn smooth from decades of fingertips brushing past. Inside was a stack of folders, brittle receipts from harvest seasons long gone, a few of Harold's hunting licenses, and beneath it all, the envelope. Thick, yellowing slightly at the edges, still sealed with the same care I'd used the day I tucked it away after Harold passed. The weight of it in my hands was heavier than paper had any right to be. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one we'd bought from the general store when Andrew was 5. The light from the window poured across the wood, and I took a breath before sliding my finger under the seal. There it was. The original deed, signed in black ink, with both our names printed neatly across the top. Harold and Dorothy Langston. The date stamped in the corner read April 2nd, 1978. That was the spring we finally paid off the last of the mortgage, when Harold brought home a bottle of cold cider, and we sat on the porch in silence, watching the fields stretch out like a promise. We'd worked for this land. Every acre had sweat in it. Every tree, every fence post had come at the cost of long days and sore backs and dreams set aside. As I held that document, I realized something I hadn't fully let myself feel until then. The land was not just soil and space. It was memory. It was marriage. It was the echo of our son's laughter when he used to run barefoot through the clover. It was the place Harold took his last breath, sitting under the pecan tree with a blanket over his knees and the dog curled at his feet. This place had been more than a home. It had been a witness to our whole life. And now it had become a target, a transaction, a prize my son was counting before I was even gone. I laid the deed flat on the table and stared at it, my fingers resting gently at the corners. Andrew's words kept circling in my mind, that smug certainty that he would inherit, develop, profit. I thought of the blueprints he must have drawn in his head, the parking lots and concrete he had already imagined sinking into my garden, the bulldozers ready to scrape away the orchard Harold had planted in '83. He thought I was too tired to stop him, too broke to defend what mattered. But what he didn't know, what he never thought to ask, was that I had been saving something more powerful than money. I had been saving silence, and silence, when held long enough, becomes something sharp, something you can wield. I folded the deed carefully, returned it to its envelope, and placed it back in the drawer. Not because I was hiding it, but because I knew that soon, very soon, I would be ready to use it. When Andrew was born, I remember thinking he had Harold's eyes, wide and watchful, with a kind of quiet depth that made me believe he'd grow up thoughtful. He was always a clever child, quick to learn and quicker to charm. He'd sit on the porch with his knees drawn up, scribbling pictures of barns and bridges, saying he'd be an architect one day. We'd smile and tell him he could be anything. And for a while, I truly believed it. I believed in the power of love, of sacrifice, of laying down your own comfort so your children could rise. I suppose most mothers do. We are raised to think of love as something you prove with self-denial. I went without new shoes for years, patching mine until the soles were more thread than leather. I worked extra hours at the clinic, cleaned houses on weekends, took on stitching jobs at night. Every dollar I saved went to his school fund. When he got into the university, I remember the look on his face when I handed him the check. He didn't ask where it came from, and I didn't tell him about the ring I pawned. When he bought his first house, his voice cracked when he called to ask if I could co-sign. He said it was temporary. He said I was the only one he trusted. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I told myself it was what any good mother would do. But what I didn't see, what I refused to admit, was that somewhere along the way, our love became a ledger, a running tally of what I had to give and what he expected to take. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. He thanked me, yes, but it was the kind of thanks you offer a waitress who refills your glass. Polite, thoughtless, automatic. I held onto the idea of legacy like it was a life raft. I imagined Andrew walking the fields with his own children one day, pointing to the orchard and saying, "My mama planted those trees." I imagined him preserving the land, not because it was valuable, but because it was ours. But that vision had never been his. It had only ever lived in me. Now I understood that legacy, at least the kind I had hoped for, was a story I had told myself. A sweet, aching lie whispered in the silence of sacrifice. And I began to see just how costly that lie had been. Not in dollars, but in trust, in time, in the quiet erosion of being seen. That night, I stood by the window looking out at the moonlit fields, and I felt something inside me begin to settle. Not resignation, but clarity. The kind that comes when the fog lifts and you realize the road you thought you were walking with someone has turned into a path you've been on alone. And maybe that was all right. Maybe it was time to stop walking in circles around a legacy that was never truly shared. I hadn't been to the county records office in years. The building still had the same cracked linoleum floors and the same humming fluorescent lights overhead, casting everything in that washed-out pale. The clerk behind the counter was new, or at least new to me. She smiled politely as I stepped forward and gave my name. I told her I needed to check any recent filings or inquiries related to my property. I made my voice steady, casual, the way women are taught to ask for things without making a fuss. She typed something into the computer and clicked through a few screens. Her brow furrowed slightly. Then she said, "You've had some zoning interest logged here. Nothing final, but definitely flagged." She turned the screen so I could see it. A company name I didn't recognize was listed, along with a development note that made my stomach twist. Future residential subdivision, preliminary exploration, no owner approval recorded. I asked for a printout and tucked it carefully into my purse. I thanked her and walked outside into the bright sun, blinking hard. My hands were trembling by the time I reached the car. I sat there for a long moment, engine off, just breathing. That's when it hit me. Andrew had already started the process. He'd gone ahead and laid the groundwork like it was all settled, like I was already gone. It hadn't been a passing thought or idle musing on a phone call. It was a plan he'd built behind my back, using a name that wasn't his and papers he never asked me for. I thought about the business suits he used to wear when he came to visit, about how his talk had slowly shifted from memories to markets, how he'd once walked out into the back pasture, phone in hand, and gestured toward the tree line, like he was already drawing the map. At the time, I'd thought he was just proud, maybe even dreaming a little. I hadn't realized he was mapping out my erasure. That night, I pulled out the folder again. I laid it beside the printout from the county office. There was no mistaking it. The coordinates, the parcel number, the signature lines waiting to be filled. All of it told the same story. He was banking on land that wasn't his, and never once considered he might not get it. I stared at the papers and wondered what kind of man could look at a field full of his childhood and see only dollar signs. Then I realized it wasn't about the land. It was about control, about a son who had grown used to taking and a mother who had grown used to giving. But habits can be broken, even old ones, especially old ones. And in that moment, sitting in my quiet kitchen with the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the old wall clock, I decided I wouldn't let greed be the final chapter written on this land. Not by him, not by anyone. I found the pamphlet by accident. It was wedged between two recipe books at the library, as if someone had meant to take it and changed their mind at the last minute. A folded brochure printed on soft recycled paper with a green tree on the front. Langford County Conservation Trust, protecting open land for future generations. I slipped it into my bag without thinking, the same way you might pick up a feather on a trail. It felt like nothing. And yet something about it stayed with me all afternoon. When I got home, I sat with a cup of tea and unfolded the pamphlet at the kitchen table. Inside were photographs of wild meadows, local forests, and handwritten testimonials from farmers who had partnered with the trust. There was a section about conservation easements, about preserving land in its natural state so it could never be developed. No shopping centers, no subdivisions, just the land, left whole. I read it twice before I picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was young, friendly, and calm. Her name was Marnie. She asked if I had time to come by the office, and I said I'd be there the next morning. I didn't tell her why. Not yet. I just needed to see what kind of people would bother to protect something most folks didn't even look at anymore. The trust office was in an old train depot converted into a workspace. Hardwood floors, sun-warmed windows, and walls covered in maps of creeks and ridgelines. Marnie greeted me at the door like she already knew who I was. She had that patient energy that doesn't push or pry, just listens. We sat down in a room filled with light and quiet, and I told her about the land, not the acres or the property lines, but the real story. I told her about the deer path that cuts through the eastern grove, about the way the soil smells when the rains come after a long dry spell. I told her about Harold and the pecan tree, about Andrew's first snowman near the old shed, and the hawks that nest in the big elm every spring. She didn't take notes. She just looked at me, nodding, as if she'd been waiting to hear this. When I finally mentioned my son and his plans, she didn't flinch. She said, very gently, that they had helped other families in similar situations, that there were ways to protect the land without cutting ties, that sometimes preserving a place was the only way to honor what it had given you. We talked for nearly an hour. When I left, she handed me a simple folder. Inside were options, forms, and a timeline. Nothing was rushed, nothing was pressured, but everything was clear. As I walked back to my car, I looked out over the fields in the distance. My fields. I imagined them staying just as they were long after I was gone. Wild, whole, untouched. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't anger or grief. It was resolve, quiet, steady, unshakable. The morning after my meeting with the trust, I woke before the sun. There was no decision left to make. It had already been made in the way my hands had folded the pamphlet the night before, in the way my feet carried me out of bed with a quiet certainty I hadn't felt in years. I poured a cup of coffee, wrapped a shawl over my shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was still, filled with the smell of dew and old wood, the kind of morning that asks nothing of you but your attention. I started with the front pasture. The grass was knee-high in places, but soft, like velvet moving under the wind. I walked the fence line slowly, fingers brushing the splintered posts Harold had repaired each spring like it was a ritual. The sun began to lift behind the hills, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across time itself. I paused by the orchard, where the trees still bore the marks of our hands. The apples would be ready in a few weeks, red and misshapen, never quite perfect, but always enough. I whispered to Harold there, just soft things, memories more than words. I told him what Andrew had done. I told him what I was planning. I told him I wished he could see the woman I'd become now that the giving had stopped, the woman who finally understood that love does not mean surrender. Farther on, I passed the chicken coop, now empty but still standing. Andrew had taken his first steps right there, wobbling across the yard toward Harold, who held out both arms and wept like it was a miracle. I could still hear the echo of it, faint but insistent, tucked in the corners of this land, like a promise. I kept walking. The pecan tree was last. It stood near the western edge, tall and steady. The bark split from years of storms. That was where Harold liked to sit in his final months, wrapped in the old green blanket, watching the sky change color. I placed my hand on the trunk and leaned in, closing my eyes. I imagined him beside me, silent, but nodding. By the time I made the full circle, the day had fully opened. Birds were starting to call, and the barn cat had stretched out across the porch rail like a sentinel. I sat down on the steps and felt the heat of the wood seep into my legs. My body was tired, but my mind was calm. This walk wasn't goodbye in the traditional sense. It wasn't an ending. It was an offering. A farewell to the version of me that had waited too long, trusted too easily, given without boundaries. It was also a quiet promise to everything this land had ever meant to us, that it would stay whole, that it would never be parceled into something ugly, that it would remain sacred. It was all so quiet in the end. No notary in a suit, no conference table, no drama. Just a room in the trust office, a soft hum from a nearby fan, and the steady scratch of a pen moving across the page. Marnie slid each document forward with gentle precision, explaining each one without fanfare. A conservation easement, recorded and binding. A transfer of intent, clear and enforceable. My name would remain tied to the land, but with it came protection. No one would build here, not now, not ever. She looked at me only once while I signed, as if to say, "You're sure?" I nodded without words. I had never been more sure of anything in my life. When we finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It was a small gesture, warm and steady. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone touched my hand like that without needing something in return. I smiled. Not with joy exactly, but with the peace that comes when a burden finally shifts from your shoulders. The papers were tucked into a folder. She told me a copy would be sent to the county, another kept in their archives. There would be a sign posted at the edge of the land, if I wanted one. I said yes. A simple wooden sign. Nothing flashy. Just the name of the trust and a single sentence. Protected in perpetuity. When I stepped outside, the sky had softened into a late afternoon blue, the kind that makes you squint a little but feels like home. I didn't rush to the car. I walked a block or two first, just to stretch my legs, just to let the air move through me. It was strange. I'd always thought such a moment would be marked with tears or hesitation, but there was no grief here, just a quiet fullness. Like I had done something not just right, but necessary. Back at home, I placed the folder in the same cedar drawer where the old deed had once lived. I didn't burn the originals. I didn't need to erase the past, but I no longer felt chained to it. Andrew didn't know yet. He wouldn't suspect anything until he reached out to the county again. By then, the records would be updated. The development, the profit, the future he'd built in his head, it would all be gone. Not taken from him, not stolen. Returned to silence, to wildness, to the kind of memory that can't be paved over. He showed up the following Sunday. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw him, and something inside me stilled. I wiped my hands on my apron, glanced at the clock, and pulled the coffee from the burner. I didn't hurry. By the time I opened the door, he was halfway up the steps, smiling wide like he hadn't vanished for months. "Hey, Mom," he said, like nothing had changed. "Thought I'd drop in. Got time for coffee?" I stepped aside, nodded once, and led him to the kitchen. He talked a mile a minute while I poured our cups. His voice was light, cheerful, almost performative. He complimented the smell of the cinnamon rolls I'd baked, asked how I'd been keeping busy, dropped names I didn't recognize. I just listened, nodding occasionally, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. He reached for his cup, took a sip, and then leaned back in his chair. "So," he began casually, "some friends of mine are really interested in that land out back. They've got big ideas, low-impact stuff, nothing crazy, but we'd need to move fast on permits. Just wanted to see if maybe we could start talking numbers." I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl. Then I looked up and smiled. "That land's already spoken for." His expression faltered just for a moment. He tried to recover. "What do you mean?" "I sold it," I said simply. "Last week." The silence that followed was dense, like a storm just before the thunder. "To who?" he asked, though I think he already knew. "A conservation trust. It's protected now." He blinked, mouth slightly open, like he was still waiting for the punchline. I didn't give him one. I just took a bite of my roll and said, "No condos, no permits, just birds, trees, and silence." He didn't finish his coffee, didn't touch the roll. He left 20 minutes later without another word. And I stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the driveway he used to race his bike on as a boy. There was no joy in it, no triumph, just a kind of stillness that felt earned. 3 days passed before he called. I let it go to voicemail. Then another 2 days, and he tried again. This time, his voice was sharper, edged with something that wasn't quite anger, not yet, but disbelief. "We need to talk, Mom," he said. "Seriously, can we meet?" I told him to come by on Saturday. The weather had turned cool again, and I baked an apple tart with the last of the season's fruit. I didn't do it for him. I did it for myself. For the rhythm, for the comfort of it. He arrived right at noon. This time there was no smile, no casual charm. He stepped inside like a man walking into a courtroom. I poured the coffee anyway. We sat across from each other at the table, the deed folder resting between us like a silent third party. He looked at it, then at me. "You really did it," he said. I nodded. I did. His jaw worked, clenched tight. "You didn't even talk to me. You had no right." I set my cup down slowly. I had every right. It's mine. He opened the folder, scanned the top pages, then tossed it back onto the table like it burned him. "You don't understand what you've done. That land could have meant something. To all of us." I watched him carefully. "It does mean something. That's why I protected it. You were planning to erase it." He scoffed, frustrated. "It's just land, Mom. Dirt and trees. We could have built something real." I leaned forward just a little. "We already did. Your father and I built a life on it. We raised you there. We fed this land with our hands, our time, our care. You wanted to turn it into a profit margin." He stared at me then, as if seeing me for the first time. And maybe he was. Maybe for all his life he had only seen what I gave him, never the woman doing the giving, never the person underneath the apron and the holiday meals and the emergency bailouts. Just the function, not the soul. "I thought you'd leave it to me," he said finally. "I thought that was the plan." "No," I said. "That was your plan. Mine was different." He sat there for a long time, shoulders tight, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, tucked the folder under his arm, and left without another word. The screen door snapped behind him like punctuation. I stayed seated, my hands wrapped around the cooling cup of coffee. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. There's a line between what we owe to others and what we must hold for ourselves. And sometimes, drawing that line is the only way to make sure your story isn't written by someone else. The first time I heard the hawk again, it was just past dawn. I was sitting on the porch with my second cup of coffee, wrapped in my old shawl, the chill of morning resting gently on my knees. The call came from the elm, sharp and steady, slicing through the quiet like a thread pulling everything into place. I looked up and saw it there, wings half spread in the wind, watching. That tree had stood through storms and droughts. It had shaded Harold while he read, and held nests each spring. Like cradles cupped in branches, it had survived more than most. And now, it would survive still. The Conservation Trust sent someone a few days later to install the sign, a simple wooden post at the edge of the property, facing the road. No advertisements, no warnings, just a name and a promise, protected in perpetuity. I stood beside it after they left, running my fingers along the grain. It felt like carving your initials into something lasting, not to claim it, but to honor it. People started noticing, not many, just the few who still cared about the edges of this town. A neighbor stopped by to ask what it meant. I explained it simply. "It means no one will ever build here." She nodded slowly and said it was good to know someone still cared about what stays wild. I think that's the word I've come to love most. Wild. Not chaotic, not out of control, just free. Untamed in the way the earth is when it's left alone. This land doesn't need to be improved. It needs to be left to breathe, to heal, to remember. Inside the house, things feel lighter now. I've cleaned out the spare room where Harold used to keep his tools. I opened the windows that hadn't been touched in years. The air smells different. Not new exactly, just honest, like it's finally telling the truth. I still hear from Andrew, though not as often. His messages are polite, a little stiff. I sense a distance now that neither of us quite knows how to cross. And maybe we don't need to. Maybe the space between us is just another kind of boundary, one that protects us from expecting things we were never going to give each other again. But I don't regret it. Not a second. Not even when I lie awake at night and wonder how it all unraveled. Because some things are worth protecting, even at the cost of love. Especially when that love forgets who you are. Now, when I step outside, I don't feel like a placeholder. I don't feel like a woman waiting for someone to decide her worth. I feel like a keeper of something sacred. Birds, trees, and silence. And nothing else needs to be said. The phrase doesn't sting the way it once did. I've heard it again, in my mind mostly, like a distant bell that used to ring every time I looked at my hands, or thought about the years I gave up to make someone else's path easier. Too broke to matter. It played over and over in the weeks after I overheard Andrew, circling my thoughts like a storm cloud that wouldn't pass. But now, it feels like something left behind. Like an old coat, hung up for the last time. That phrase said more about him than it ever said about me. It was never about money. It was about dismissal. About assuming that someone without leverage is someone without value. That a woman past her prime, with no job title and no influence, has nothing left to do but step aside. But the truth is, people like me have more power than anyone realizes. Quiet power, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, the kind that waits and watches and then chooses. I chose silence for a long time. I let Andrew believe I would give him everything, because I didn't want to believe the truth about how far he'd drifted. I didn't want to see that the boy I had once carried through fevers and long nights had grown into a man who saw me as temporary, a stepping stone. But once I saw it, I could not unsee it. And once I understood what he had planned for the land, for the orchard, for the fields Harold and I spent a lifetime tending, there was no going back. Now I wake with the sunrise, not because I have to, but because I want to. The light comes in through the curtains in ribbons, brushing the walls with gold. The house feels settled. The land is quiet, not in mourning, but in peace. I still think about legacy, but not in the way I used to. Not as something you pass down in a will, not as property or profit. Legacy is the echo of the choices you make when no one is watching. It's the way the earth holds memory, the way silence can mean strength. My son may never understand why I did what I did. And maybe that's all right. Understanding isn't always a requirement for forgiveness, but it is a requirement for trust. And trust, once broken, does not return just because someone wants it to. I may be broke in his eyes, but I am not broken. I am a woman who knows what she owns. I am a woman who knows what she owes herself, and that will always matter. The grass is taller now. I've stopped cutting it the way I used to. There's something beautiful about letting it grow, watching the wind move through it in long, unbroken waves. The birds have returned in numbers I hadn't seen in years. I keep a small journal now, jotting down the ones I recognize. Cardinals, thrashers, a woodpecker that visits the pecan tree every other morning. Sometimes I sit at the edge of the property, near the new sign, and just listen. Not to anything in particular, just the space between sounds. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of a cricket, the way the air shifts when a hawk cuts across the sky. I think silence is where truth lives. It's where the stories you never said out loud start to breathe. I remember Harold that way, in silence. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence was constant. Like the oak in the far corner of the pasture. Always there. When he died, I thought I'd feel hollow. But I didn't. I felt full. Not of grief, but of everything we built. It stayed with me, even as Andrew grew up and left, even as the house got quieter and the calendar pages turned faster. Now, I understand something I didn't before. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let go. Not with bitterness, not with a need to teach someone a lesson, but with the grace of knowing what you've already given. I let go of the land not by losing it, but by choosing how it would live beyond me. I kept the deed not because I needed control, but because I needed time to see clearly. I needed space to remember that my worth isn't measured by what I leave behind, but by what I protect. Letting the field rest wasn't surrender. It was restoration. I don't know what Andrew will tell people about me in the years to come. Maybe he'll say I was stubborn. Maybe he'll say I made things harder than they needed to be. Or maybe, if he ever walks this land again with open eyes, he'll see what I saw. He'll hear the quiet. He'll feel the stillness. and he'll understand. For now, I sit with my coffee and the hum of the day unfolding around me. The house is old, my bones ache sometimes, but there is peace here. Real peace. The kind that grows slowly, like roots beneath the surface. Unseen, but unshakable. The land is safe. The story is mine. And finally, I am home.